Welcome everybody to part 3 of this video series where I walk through a run of the chess.com Puzzle Rush survival mode, where essentially I have unlimited time to solve as many chess problems as possible of increasing difficulty. Now in the first two videos in this series, which I will link below, I did the first 40 problems of the Puzzle Rush run, and in this video we will be doing problems 40 to 50 or 40 to 55 depending on how much time it's going to take us to solve each one. And to remind you, the rationale behind this series is to walk through every single problem to explain how I solve them, whether the problems are easy or hard. And you know, in this part, the one thing I wanted to say before we launch in is that it's very, very important, if you are in this to truly improve, if you have a board lying around, I will be doing a lot of analysis because these problems are quite difficult. There's bound to be variations and longer variations than previously in the problem. So you're very much welcome to set these positions up on your board and follow along. That will really help with the visualization. With that being said, I will try to make all of the variations very clear. And without further ado, let us jump into problem number 41. And here is black to move. So now we have a situation where multiple white pieces are hanging, and these types of situations tend to intimidate people because it seems very chaotic. But we have to approach this very methodically and simply understand the difference between capturing the multiple pieces available for capture. So if we take the knight with either the pawn or the queen, actually, the bishop can move. So if we take with the queen, that looks like a fork, but the bishop could actually walk back to e2 and cover the check. Now, if we take the bishop, however, what happens is that the knight on e5 is and remains pinned. So we want to take the bishop because that's a higher degree of urgency, because this knight is actually not going anywhere. So it's imperative to take the bishop. Okay, he takes on f7 with the queen, which, you know, it gets a pawn for the piece, but white still loses a piece. We take the queen, and we take the knight. So a lot of chaos seemed to be on the board, but in these situations, we simply compare the situation that arises after we capture each of the pieces. Nothing to it. Okay, so here we have white to move, and white is in check, so that really limits our options. It would be great if we could take the rook, but we can't because we're in check. And, you know, first I start with some observations, as we usually do. And what I want to make very clear is that even when we solve the more complicated problems, if I've done this right, you know, the process of solving them doesn't really change. You know, the difficulty certainly rises and there might be more variations involved, but the actual underlying process of solving these problems doesn't actually change. And hopefully I'll be able to inspire people to realize that you too, with enough time and persistence, can solve these problems and not get intimidated by, you know, the rating attached to them. So we're in check, and it's clear that we're also attacking black's king. We've got a lot of pieces clustered around black's king. This bishop is also hanging. You know, there is a direct mate threat, rook h7. So it appears to me that one of our first tasks has to be to stave off the checks, you know, to escape the checks as quickly as possible. And with that in mind, let's try to compare the possible king escapes. So we have king h1, king g2, and king f1. Let's start with those, and if none of those work, we'll look at different ways of blocking the check. So king f1 seems the least likely to me because it steps right into that rook's x-ray on the f-file. We'll return to this move a little bit later, but let's first start with the moves that seem, you know, likeliest to be correct, and then if they don't work, then we'll look at the more sort of paradoxical options. Let's look at king g2 for a second. Now the key question is, does king g2 step into the path of any other checks? Well, yes it does. King g2 does step into queen d2 check, and well, the king cannot go to h3 because that is blocked by the bishop, so the king has to go back to either h1 or g1, and well, that I suppose allows another check with the queen on c1 this time, and the line goes on. So let's put that aside. That does not seem to be the most convincing way of escaping the checks. That leaves us with king h1. Let's take a look at that for a second. So king h1 Do we see any other plausible checks for black? Well, let's take a look. Can black check here? No. Here? No. Or d1? No. All three of those squares are indeed covered by white's knight. So purely from the point of view of escaping all the checks immediately, king h1 seems to be the move, and I see no reason to allow any checks here. So I think just on the basis of that, we could already go king h1, bingo. Now he's taken our rook, we have to recapture his, and he goes rook e8. So with some of these problems, you see that the solutions are longer and there's more hurdles in the way. Now the key question to ask yourself after rook e8 is, can we take the bishop, right? It's clear that queen g7 is not checkmate because the queen covers the square. So what is black cooking up after we take the bishop? Well, probably he's going to give us this check on e1, which looks scary, but let's actually flesh that out for a second. Rook e1 check. I feel like I said out with a Canadian accent. Man, I'm working with some Canadians recently. Don't hold it against me. Okay, so queen takes d7, rook e1 check. Well, king g2, right? And again, in these positions, you want to be very methodical and not get intimidated by, oh, you know, there's so many checks. Just if you kind of plunge in and calculate, sometimes you'll see that the position is simpler than it looks, and I think that's the case here. So queen takes d7, rook e1, king g2. He can give a check on the g1 square. Let me draw it with different colored arrows to make this a little bit clear. So rook e1 check, then king g2, then how do I draw? I need to draw. Oh, there we go. Rook g1 check. I don't know if that made it more confusing or clear, but in any case, the king just escapes to h3. And you might say, wait a second, is there a bishop? But remember, we've captured the bishop on d7, clearing out the h3 square. And as a side note, that's one important piece of advice. When you're calculating, a lot of people forget that certain pieces have been taken off the board, and they assume that moves are illegal because there's a piece guarding a square, but that piece has already been captured. So make sure that when you're calculating and visualizing, you try to sort of take stock of which pieces have been taken off the board explicitly, because that can really help you avoid that mistake. And once the king escapes to h3, well, black can take the rook there with check, but we can essentially, I think, take a shortcut and stop there. Because it's pretty clear to me that black is going to run out of checks and white is going to end up at least a piece up. So there isn't any need to flesh things out any further. There we go. As long as we know that we're not getting checkmated, the problem has been solved. Okay, next problem. So what do we have here? Well, my eyes are just drawn, as I'm sure yours are, to white's king, and the fact that it is literally surrounded by pieces. Now, those who are perhaps more familiar with these types of positions will realize that white has played this move g3 probably to fianchetto a bishop on g2, but that bishop has been taken off the board, which means that white has all of these light squared weaknesses right around his king, which is of course very problematic because black's got this bishop on h3. And it might seem possible to set up what I think the cool kids now call a lobster pincer mate with a queen ending up on g2. Now, how can we go about doing that? Well, the first move that comes to my mind is actually, and we can use the sort of checks, captures, and threats shortcut to get ourselves to look at these moves. But queen takes f3 is a move that comes to my mind because I see that if the pawn takes the queen, then I capture the rook with checkmate. And, well, how did I see that move? Well, I noticed this bishop on h3 is essentially covering up the king's only potential escape square on the second rank. So I realized that, well, first rank checkmates could potentially be possible here. Okay, so with these problems, one of the sources of difficulty that we see is actually there's some very, very tricky defensive moves that are featured in some of these problems, and we have to take note of these defensive moves and be very disciplined about trying to find them. So after queen takes f3, one thing that white has here, if we look at the whole position, we look at all of white's pieces, and we take a look at this queen on b7, white can actually capture the rook on c8 with check. And after bishop takes c8, then he could capture the queen. And notice that the bishop, again, is no longer covering the g2 square. So taking the rook on e1, which that would not be mate, the king would be able to move to g2. So what's going on in that position? Well, black has two bishops and white has only one bishop, so black is up a piece. So that would already satisfy essentially the expectations of this puzzle. Now, maybe some of you are looking at this and saying, well, wait a minute, why don't we switch the order of operations here and try to get that lobster pincer mate and take on e2 with the rook first, taking the defender away from the knight, and then we take the knight and deliver the mate on g2. Well, that actually, I think, is inaccurate, and the reason why is much the same as the defensive resource after queen takes f3, immediately accepts it's more effective. So follow carefully. If rook takes e2, what white does is he takes the rook on c8 with check, attacking black's queen. So black has to take the queen, and then white takes the rook on e2. And guess what? White has 2 rooks for the queen. The knight on f3 is no longer hanging. 2 rooks for the queen is approximately balanced. That's not good enough. So it's a lot better to end up a piece up than to end up in that unbalanced position. So we do indeed take here, and take here. Okay. Another situation in which it's clear that white has, quite the overwhelming advantage. He's got an extra exchange. He's got this passed pawn. He's got a huge attack on black's king. And it seems that the first order of business is to get out of the checks. And I think a quick look reveals that king f2 is a pretty absurd move. It walks right into queen e3 check. So, well, I'm not even talking about queen d1. Problem 80, that might be the solution, but not yet. So king h2 is an only move. Now, one very quick note before I make the move. I think that a lot of people are under the impression that you aren't really supposed to make moves until you've calculated out the whole sequence. I don't entirely agree with that, because at the end of the day, why are we solving these problems? We're solving them to get better at real chess. And in real chess, if there was a move that you knew was correct, okay, there was a move you knew you had to make, would you hold off on that move because somewhere down the line you didn't exactly know how to proceed? I mean, no, that would be absurd, right? So I think that we can allow ourselves to make forced moves in puzzles to make our task easier. There's nothing particularly wrong with that. I think that, once again, we're trying to mimic real tournament surroundings. Okay, so f3, that's a move that makes a lot of noise. It looks intimidating, but let's actually unpack what it's doing. What is it doing? I mean, we can take the pawn with 2 different pieces, but one thing that's important to consider, whenever a pawn is pushed, squares have been left behind that pawn that are now accessible to pieces, okay? This is true of literally, mathematically true of any pawn move, especially these types of far advanced pawn moves. With a weak king, you want to check which squares have been left behind, and here the f4 square has been left behind. That is the square that the queen could give a check from, and that would not be a very desirable check in my book to allow, potentially, but it might be. It's just something to consider. So from a logical perspective, taking the pawn with the queen seems to be logical, but in these problems, like I said, it's important not to rush and appraise yourself of all the possibilities before you make a move. And if we look a little bit deeper, okay, let's imagine that we take the pawn with the queen. When we take the pawn with the queen, we relinquish some of the attack on black's king, which gives the pieces around black's king, i.e. the bishop, a little bit more freedom, which means that after we take the pawn with the queen, the bishop can actually take d6, okay? Why couldn't he take d6 earlier? Because the queen had this devastating check on h8. And if the bishop takes this pawn, and you count the material, we see that black actually has a bishop and a pawn for a rook, which is a little bit of a material advantage for the side with the rook, but it's not a lot. And if you look even closer, you'll see that after he takes the pawn with the bishop, black has this very nasty threat of a discovered attack against white's king, which would win the queen if the queen remained on f3. So we'll put that aside. I don't think that that is very clear. Let's take a look at what other options we have in this position. And once again, technically speaking, when we talk about checks, captures, and threats, right? The method of actually looking for checks, captures, and threats loses its effectiveness if you try to do self-selection. If you try to kind of pare down the decision tree and say, well, this capture looks absurd, I'm not even going to look at it. You know what? That's going to lessen the effectiveness of this method, because every method of searching for moves in chess essentially has the ultimate aim of making you kind of think like a chess computer. And if you know anything about chess computers, you'll know that they literally, in any position, look at every possible legal move, okay? They look at every possible legal move, and that way they don't miss the stuff that humans miss. Now, what is it that humans miss? Well, humans miss moves that to the superficial glance might seem ridiculous or something that shouldn't be considered. And so we should be aware of that when we're examining very chaotic positions. So for that reason, let's take a look at all of the possible captures here. So that brings us to g takes f3. And I think that move suffers from much the same faults that queen takes f3 suffers from. Black has a check on f4, and he has also a check on d2, and he can actually use the queen then to capture that pawn on d6. I'm just not sure that that yields quite enough of an advantage. So again, we're going to put that aside, and we're going to look at some of the other options. What are the other captures? Well, this capture and this capture just give up a queen. But what about this capture on f8? Let's take a look at it for a second, okay? If the king captures on f8, I notice that the king is out of the e7 square, and queen h8 there is actually checkmate, okay? It's actually checkmate. But wait a moment, after rook takes f8, black does not have to take the rook. He can deliver this check on f4, which looks very nasty. And then we have another one of those tasks where we have to escape the checks. And we can notice that we can block that check with a move g2 to g3. Then the queen has only one check possible, right? d2. This would be a great moment if you have a board lying around. You're welcome to make those moves on the board as I'm saying them, or you could attempt to visualize them. It's not such a long line. So to repeat, take the bishop, queen f4 check, g3, queen d2 check. Okay, and then the king goes up to h3. And actually, black does have one more check. He can give the check on g2 with the queen, but then the king escapes to g4, and white is completely safe. And you could almost take a shortcut there. When a queen is delivering a checks like this to a king that's surrounded by its own pawns and pieces, chances are there's going to be a way to escape the checks. So we could use our intuition to determine that, but as we see, it's not that difficult to calculate out. And so rook takes f8, I believe, offers by far the most convincing path to victory. Here we go, queen f4 check. Notice that other moves here do not yield the same results. King h3 allows another check. So it seems to me that g3 is really the most convincing, and there we go. A difficult problem for sure, but not an insurmountable one. We broke it down into several smaller tasks, and notice the key to finding that move rook takes f8. We forced ourselves to look at all of the captures, not just the obvious ones. So don't do that intuitive self-selection when in a very sharp position. Force yourself to look at moves that might seem, at first glance a little bit absurd. Okay, so we have a position with white to move here. And I will say, by the way, that these actually take me a while to solve. So as I'm talking it through, I'm literally solving it. It's not like I've seen this before and I already know the solution. I'm also solving it as I'm talking, which is what makes this so interesting to me and hopefully to you as well. So let's try to figure out what the heck is going on here. Now, once again, a situation where material is equal, but I don't really care about that. It's clear that this game is going to be decided by an attack on one of the kings. Both kings are very weak. Black's king is particularly weak because it is surrounded here. This g6 pawn can offer its control over several squares. There's a check on h6 here. There's a lot of stuff that white can do in a position like this. So let's try to figure out, what are the specific things that white can actually do in terms of attacking black's king. So first we start with checks, captures, and threats. Well, the only capture is b takes a5, which could literally not be more irrelevant than this. And watch that be the solution. So we can discount b takes a5. Now let's transition to the checks. Well, there's rook h8 check that seems to blunder the rook, and I don't see a potential benefit to that. You can give a check with a pawn, which is very doubtful because the pawn is what seems to be one of the main drivers of the attack. So you can take the pawn, let's say with the queen, and we don't have a follow-up. And we can give a check on h6 with the queen, which may look a little bit more tempting. But once again, the bishop just blocks that check, and I don't think that white has a good follow-up there. But let's transition to threats. Could we threaten any of black's pieces? And in this regard, one thing that I recommend is to start with the pieces that are undefended, the pieces that are not protected by any other pieces or pawns. In this case, all of black's pieces are undefended, so it's a little bit less effective, but here we could perhaps spot the piece that seems to be the most attackable, and to me that looks like the bishop on f6 because, well, it's the closest to black's king. Now, how can we pose a threat to this bishop? Well, we can't use our bishop. We can't use our rook. Can we use our queen? We can't put it here. We could put it on f2. Wait a second. We could put it on f2. And that not only attacks the bishop, but it pins the bishop to the king. And then when we set a pin, that means the squares that the bishop was formerly covering are now accessible to our pieces. Are there any such squares we might be interested in accessing? There is. Look at this h8 square that was previously inaccessible to white's rook. That's a pretty darn juicy square, I would say. So we got to keep that in mind. So queen f2. How can black defend the bishop? Let's not get overwhelmed here, be methodical. He can defend it in a variety of ways with his queen, right? He can play queen g5, queen e6, queen takes d4. It's all... And when you are considering your opponent's defensive replies, you want to sort of group them into categories, because sometimes that makes it easier and less overwhelming, and sometimes an entire category of different moves could have the same response to it, and I think that's the case here. Now, remember I mentioned that this rook had this check on h8. Well, let's take a look at that. Let's say queen f2. Let's take a representative response to ground this in reality. Let's say black, I don't know, plays queen to g5. And we give a check on h8 with the rook, okay? The king has to move to one of two squares, either e7 or g7. And then if you look very carefully at that position, I also mentioned noticing the undefended pieces. Well, this rook is also undefended. So what we could do is drop the rook back to h7 check, skewering the king to the rook. And then when the king moves away, we will pick off an entire black rook. What's important here is not getting fixated and tunnel visioning the king, but also looking at all of black's pieces and how they figure and how they you know, be a part of this attack in general. When you're attacking, it's not only about going for checkmate, it's also about using the weak king position perhaps to win material. Okay, so that category seems to have been dealt with. What are the other ways of defending that bishop? Well, the king can defend that bishop, right? Can step forward to g7 or e7, but none of those moves. Once we refuted the queen defenses, those moves are not intimidating because he steps right into the skewer, and so we win the rook immediately. Well, are there any other ways of defending the bishop? I don't see any, right? He can defend it with his king. He can defend it with his queen. He cannot defend it with his rook because, well, that g6 one is really the unsung hero. It's the driving force behind all of this. The pawn just takes the rook, so I think we can safely play queen f2. And indeed, the response chosen by the algorithm is queen g5 check, and we can safely... Now, normally I would spend a little bit more time actually verifying my conclusions there rather than playing the moves immediately, but for full effect, you know, we can see that our logic there was actually very, very good. Okay, so what I might do, you know, these problems are taking us a while, so I might do one or two more because I want to keep this video to sort of a reasonable length. I want to give people a chance to internalize some of the advice that I've shared. So let's go ahead and do two more problems, something like that, and then pause. And, you know, at some point, I myself will start getting problems wrong because they become incredibly difficult. So I'll decide what to do then. I might do another video on like one problem. But anyway, I'll cross that bridge when I get there. In the meantime, let's settle on two more exercises for now. And it seems that our hands are indeed full and our work cut out for us in this exercise. What the heck is going on here? Well, first of all, materially, we have four minor pieces, right? Yeah, two bishops and two knights. Black has two rooks, a knight, and a bishop, and he's also got a pawn that's threatening to promote. So it is very clear to me that we need to deliver checkmate here. That is a conclusion we can safely make here because black is overwhelmingly up material. I mean, it's not even frickin' close. And the other thing is this king is almost out of squares, right? It is no g2 square, no g1 square. That's covered by the knight. It's effectively only got... Whoops, no. What am I doing? I don't even know why I'm trying these out. It's actually got only two squares, and we can take one of them away with a bishop check on d3, which is, I think, what we should start with, because that seems sensible. So bishop d3 check, and then king e1. Let's take a moment to think about that position. And one thing that I'll mention as I think about this is that a lot of times people assume these positions, every move has to be with check. That's not necessarily entirely true. There could be quiet moves that are made to deprive the king of potential escape squares, and that move doesn't have to be a check. So, and a lot of difficulty in chess actually comes from so-called quiet but deadly moves that don't come with check. They don't look particularly intimidating or deadly, but they are because you know, they fulfill some sort of crucial purpose, such as taking away a square from a king. So you have to look for these kinds of moves, and I'll tackle that separately, you know, in separate videos that I'll make. But right now, I'll just say that you should be aware of their existence, and you should not be too surprised when one of those moves pops up, because that's just a part of combinations and checkmates and chess and tactics is knowing when to give a check and play forcefully, and knowing when to make a quiet move. Okay, so back to the problem at hand. Bishop d3 check, king e1. Now, can we deliver any more checks to the king? Well, unfortunately, we can't deliver any effective ones, right? g3 is covered by the knight. c3 is covered by the pawn. By the way, both of those moves would have been checkmate had it not been for these pieces, which immediately leads me to ask whether I can distract or deflect either of these, either this pawn or this piece. But the answer is no. It's clear that I can't do that given the time frame that I'm operating in. Like I can try to like play knight f4, but that will remove one of the pieces that's participating in the checkmate. So I have too few pieces to assign one of them the role of just sacrificing himself for the knight or the pawn. It seems to me that this has to be more direct than that. Okay, so this check does not seem to work, at least initially. Okay. What else can we generate in the first position? Well, there's a couple of other checks, but they don't seem effective. There's knight d2 check. And that allows two potential escapes, right? King e2 being the one that seems most sensible, you know, moving the king toward the center so it has more escape squares. Then we could give, I guess, a check on g1, and he would go king e3. We could give a smattering of checks, but, you know, we're actually drawing it farther away from checkmate. So that doesn't seem good. We can give knight e3 check, and once again, he just goes king e2, and he is threatening to take that knight. We barely even have a good check there. It is clear that we're not checkmating him then. So that leads me to the question of quiet moves. Can we make a quiet move in this position to deprive the king, as we discussed, of one of its escape squares? Well, the king has two escape squares, e1 and e2. So let's start to look at moves that take away either one or preferably both of these escape squares, and that's what we'll ask ourselves. Is there a move that takes away both? There are actually two such moves, and both of them involve our king, right? King d1 and king d2. So let's take one of them as kind of a representative sample, as we did in the last example, to see if this is even plausible. And if yes, we'll flesh this out further. So let's say, for example, king to d1. That threatens checkmate on d3, right, with the bishop. And hopefully everyone's following along. But here's the thing, right? There's a couple of things that black do there to stop that checkmate. He could either, and I think I talked about this in the previous video, he could either cover the checkmating square or create a new escape square for his king. I will make a separate video on basically defensive methods when faced with the threat of checkmate. That can help you find these defensive moves. But for now, as a shorthand, we can create a square for the king. We can cover that checkmating square. And unfortunately, black has both options available at his disposal. He can make a queen, right? Black can make a queen, and the point is not to make a queen. It is to open up that g2 square for the king, which will be a huge escape square. It seems that once the king reaches g2, white's just not going to have the firepower available to really cause it any damage. Once again, this h5 knight guards the f4 square, and it seems that the same thing happens after king to d2. Black can promote to a queen, and I don't see anything there. I mean, we can give a check with a bishop. King goes to, you know, to g2. We can give another check with a bishop. King captures the knight, and on the king goes. So, you know, we can scrap this entirely. So let's continue to look for quiet moves here that potentially fulfill the role of somehow we need to deprive the king of these squares. We simultaneously need to somehow take care of the threat of promotion. So let's take a moment here to think about this. So what do we have at our disposal here? I might actually have to go into a couple of moments of silence here and myself try to generate some of these moves and some of these possibilities. So I'm going to do that right now. I'm going to think about this for a couple of moments and share my thoughts in a second. And I very much encourage you to do the same. I'm sitting here, you know, in my apartment solving this problem. I'm not, you know, just because I'm a GM doesn't mean I see stuff automatically. And that is actually one of the things I hope to make clear in my YouTube channel in general is like, everything is a process and everything is a logical process. So set this position up on your board, and hopefully you can reach these key insights faster than I can. So I'll give myself about 15-20 seconds of thought here, and then I'll share some of my thoughts. And once again, I encourage you to do the same. So here we go. Okay. It's probably gonna be the most watched silence during a YouTube video ever. I got it. Wow. Now this is going to be beautiful, folks, and I'm going to attempt to explain how I saw this. What was the light bulb moment? And if you want to keep thinking about it, by all means, it doesn't matter what your rating is. You can do it, okay? This is the beauty of chess. Everyone can solve difficult problems. It's just a matter of discipline and being willing to make mistakes. So here's the thing. What I did was return to the move bishop d3 check, because I realized that there's really no way mathematically to deprive the king, A, of these two squares, and B, to stop promotion. I realized that that's too much to ask of any one move, which is a shortcut, and there still might be such a move, but I figure that's very unlikely. So I returned to the move bishop d3 check, okay, because it already takes care of that task, and it brings the king onto a square where it has no escape square, so it really lessens the load. Now, here's the next thing that I did. I asked myself, okay, let me wipe the slate clean. Let me assume that there were no rules in chess. What could hypothetically be the checkmating construction that wins the game, okay? And when I ask this, I am ignoring temporarily rules, pins, whatever. I'm simply trying to understand whether there even is a potential checkmating construction. And when you ask that question that way, well, I did discover one thing. I discovered that this knight on c4, it could end up on g2, okay? It could end up on g2, and that is checkmate. So if you imagine this bishop on d3, king e1, if this knight from c4 comes to g2, the king has no escapes. The bishop on d3 covers f1. Knight on h3 covers f2. King on c1 covers the two other escape squares. We don't actually need this bishop on e5. And that's another key insight. Now, why can't we get the knight there? Why can't we play the move knight c4 to e3 and attack g2 and threaten to go there? Well, because the knight is pinned, right? And why is the knight pinned? Because we've moved the bishop out from c2, exposing the pin. And so the sort of subtask that I had there is, well, can we get rid of the pin? Well, we can take the rook, but that doesn't seem forcing enough, and the other rook could replace the captured one. Could we get rid of the pin any other ways? Well, I thought about this for a second, and I thought, yes, we can. We can actually use this bishop to deliver a check on c3, sacrificing the bishop. He is forced to take, okay? But what effect does that have? That shifts the pawn from b4 to c3, which unpins the knight, because the c3 pawn, it's like a hazmat suit for these rooks that are exerting their radiation. It's like they don't infiltrate with their rays anymore. The knight is free to move. And that's one of the sort of beautiful aspects of chess. Your own pieces could be the instruments of your demise. And in many cases they are, and that's the case here. So bishop c3 check, b takes c3. Now the knight is free to go. We could go knight e3. We only have 3 pieces left. But here's the thing. I am threatening knight takes g2 checkmate, as we discussed. Now you might be laughing and saying, do you really think that black with a whole move cannot stop this threat? Well, he can't, okay? He can play the move rook to g8, for example, and he can defend with his rook the pawn on g2. That's not the only way to stop the threat. But one of the key things in these more difficult problems is to detect how the position has changed, and I mentioned this in previous videos, as a consequence of a sacrifice. Any capture that is made or any trade that is made, I always recommend, my students to stop, pause, and think about what new squares, what new possibilities have opened up as a result of certain visual transformations. And if we look at this very carefully, we might see that by shifting the bishop from c2 to d3, the c2 square has been vacated, and onto this square can land actually a white knight. that has traveled from c4 to e3 to ostensibly go to g2, but it now can also go to c2, and that is also checkmate for much the same reason. Again, do not forget, if you're trying to visualize this, that black's c3 pawn is blocking both of the rooks from not only pinning the knight, but by extension covering the c2 square. And amazingly, this is essentially a fork. You're forking, what are you forking? One checkmate threat and another. Like a fork is just an attack by the knight of two different things. Here you're forking a checkmate, which is quite beautiful actually, and a very rare situation indeed. And black has no way to stop both of these threats because he has no checks that he can deliver against white's king. So let's execute this, and I'll pause here before playing knight e3 because it might end the problem there. Again, look at what we've done. We have used the bishop to block the pin, and now we are going to shift the knight from c4 to e3, where it will threaten knight takes g2 checkmate and drumroll please, knight c2 checkmate. There's nothing black can do. His bishop would have been able to pin the knight, but it's not because it's hemmed in by this darn rook on c7. Boom, knight f4, an ingenious defensive idea. He's trying to get us to take his knight on f4, but we could not care less about that knight. We care only about black's king, and that is an observation we made at the beginning, which would help you not get distracted by a move like this. We don't care about material here. We care about checkmate. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that was a very difficult problem. That was very stimulating even to me. And you can see by the ratings here, these are serious master level problems. So I think this is actually a great time to pause the video, and we will definitely solve another set of 6 or 7 videos in the next 6 or 7 problems in the next video in this series. I keep promising to solve so many problems, and I solve relatively little, but you know, we're walking through these. It's all about quality, not quantity. And wow, I mean, incredible problem. And well, I hope that you guys have not only enjoyed this, but hopefully also benefited from it. I realize, as I said at the beginning, that these are high-level problems, and for a beginner, this could be hard to follow, but I have tried in as much as I can to explain the fundamental patterns, the thinking processes that undergird my ability to solve even complicated problems. Now, what we see is that these complicated problems are often composed of a set of simpler tasks. They're just put together, right? Like we have to escape a series of checks. And in the same problem, we also have to find like a tactical idea and again escape a series of checks, all in one problem. So it's often composed of a series of simpler tasks, or it often requires this kind of imagination, such as to return to a move that you at first abandoned, such as we did in the previous problem, look at it with a fresh pair of eyes and ask yourself the right questions about the position, and sort of think of an ideal scenario, a target position, and then try to bring that into reality, which is essentially what creativity is. So I'll see you in the next video, where I will be tackling these really increasingly difficult problems, and I will try to do the same process of explanation. So I hope that you have enjoyed, because I certainly have. And as usual, feel free to leave comments, constructive criticism, and advice, and stories about whether or not you solved problem number 40, well, I guess problem number 46, down in the comments below. I will see you in the next video. Thank you, everybody, and goodbye.